So I've been asked to talk about my career at Nightingale. I actually spent my entire working career working at Nightingale, 42 years. I started as a boychik in 1973 at the age of 23 until I retired in 2015, so a total of 42 years. Just on a personal note, I'm married to Claude, who is French. We've got 3 adult children, 2 of whom live in South London and the other lives in Brussels, and we've got 3 grandchildren. We've lived in Clapham, near Clapham Common, in the same house for over 40 years. And my connections with Nightingale were made even closer in latter years because my parents moved from Bristol to Nightingale House in 2012. My father died in 2015 and my mother died at the age of 92 this July. I was born in Bristol in the West Country in 1950. I've got one younger brother who lives in Tunbridge Wells. And I'm 3rd generation Bristolian. So I'm Bristolian, my mother was Bristolian, and surprisingly, her mother was Bristolian as well. Although my mother's father came from Romania in 1914. On my father's side of the family, they came from a place called Grodno, which was originally in Russia, which is now in Belarus. And in fact, we went several years ago, we took a trip with the family to Grodno just to get a feel of what it might have been like. And overall, it's very, very sad because the whole visit and the whole what was the Jewish community is completely overshadowed by the Holocaust. So there are just remnants of a community left there. At school, I was, not wishing to overstate it, an unremarkable student. However, I did go to college where I studied business studies, which was something which I greatly enjoyed. While I was at college, which was actually in Bournemouth, I had my first real introduction to Zionism. I joined a Zionist youth group called Hanoah Hatzioni, and that really baited my interest in Israel. And in fact, in 1972, I then went and spent a year in Israel, working on various kibbutzim. I started on a kibbutz called Palmachim near Tel Aviv. Then I moved to a beautiful kibbutz called Ginosar, which was on Lake Tiberias. And finally, I went to a place which sadly doesn't exist anymore. It was called Meshek Moshav Dikla, which was right next to El Arish in the Sinai, which of course was given back when the Sinai was given back. Then when I returned from Israel, under pressure from my parents, I came to London to seek my fortune and fame, neither of which I found. When I first came to London and I was looking for a job, I spent some months working in a market research agency called Louis Harris. It was located in Oxford Circus, and it was a very interesting place because although the work itself was mundane, collating obviously manually market research questionnaires, it was full of resting actors. So I met quite a number of resting actors there at that time. I then started looking for a job. And of course, in 1973, back in those days, there were no shortage of jobs to be had. I remember looking in the Evening Standard where there were pages and pages and pages of jobs, somewhat different to today. And I came across an advertisement which caught my eye because it had slightly unusual wording. It said, administrative assistant wanted for charitable organisation in London, a knowledge of Jewish dietary laws essential. Now, bear in mind that the first race relations legislation had come in the early 70s. I understood that then as being code for Jewish person wanted, which of course one couldn't possibly say and couldn't say today. Anyway, I applied, I went along for the interview. I was interviewed by Asher Coren in 1973. And then I had a second interview with him and with the chairman. and I was offered the job, which I started in March 1973. I found, I don't know whether any of you remember the building as it was then in the early 70s, it was a somewhat foreboding place. I would say it had the feeling of a Victorian institution. And as a 23-year-old from the provinces, it was just a tiny little bit scary going into this very institutional building. I'd lived a very sheltered parochial life until that time, and so this was a whole new world to me. I have to say that these days, when I meet young people and I tell them I come from Bristol, they say, "Oh, you're so lucky, it's such a wonderful place, it's buzzing." Well, it wasn't buzzing in the 50s and 60s. It was very, very parochial. It was very, very provincial and frankly, very boring. And I was brought up literally within a community of 200 Jewish people, which was pretty much the size of the community in Bristol. And my parents lived within the parameters of that community. There had only ever been a very small Jewish community in Bristol, and indeed that's still the case today. When I joined Nightingale, the number of people living there was 220, and it subsequently rose to 370, and I'll explain in a minute how. The vast majority of the people that were living there at that time lived in dormitories or shared accommodation, varying from perhaps 4 beds in a room up to as many as 17. Nearly all of the residents at that time spoke Yiddish. And of course, the residents in the early 1970s were very much younger than they are today. But what's interesting is if you look at photographs of residents at that time, old black and white photographs, people that were in their late 60s look as if they were 80. They just looked very, very much older than they really were. And of course, they dressed in a very somber way. All of the men wore dark suits and ties and had a regulation kippah that they had to wear all the time. So it was very, very different. At that time, 3/4 of the residents were male. It's slightly less than that today, but it was certainly very, very much of an institution. The vast majority of the people came from the East End. They were all supported financially by the local authority. And indeed, if somebody applied who had money, then they were not accepted. They were discriminated against because at that time, it was very much a charity, an institution that existed. Its raison d'etre was to help the aged poor. It wasn't there to help people with money. And I think the feeling was, well, if you've got money, you can afford to make your own arrangements somewhere else. Again, completely, completely different today. An example of how institutional it was at that time, something which I felt extremely uncomfortable with, was, again, bearing in mind I was only 23, was at Friday lunchtime, as people came into the huge dining room with a couple of hundred people in it, the men had to queue up to come in, and they had to pass a sort of an inspection where, first of all, they had to show that they had a clean folded white handkerchief and that they had a kippah, preferably on their head. And then if they passed muster, they were allowed into the dining room. And I cringe when I think of going through that now. It was all a little bit military, but in fact, it was probably more reminiscent of the workhouse, I would think. The way in which the finance worked at that time was that basically anybody that said they wanted to go into a care home was able to do so. They didn't really have to meet any physical criteria or really any financial criteria either. So they were funded by a combination of what was then the DHSS, and also by the local authorities. At that time, the charity was known as the Home for Aged Jews. Many, many years ago, in the 70s, I was once at a party locally, and somebody asked me where I worked. And I explained to them I worked at the Old People's Home in Nightingale Lane. And they said, "Ah, you mean the Muslim home?" And I said, no, 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 no. Why did they think it was a Muslim home? Because across the door it said Hajj, Home for Aged Jews. H-A-J. So originally this charity, which was known as the Hand in Hand Asylum, had its origins in Hackney, in Wells Street. It moved in 1904 to Nightingale Lane. There was a gentleman called Lord Wandsworth, whose family name was de Sturm. He was Viscount de Sturm. And he purchased this property, which was a very, very grand mansion out in the country at that time, for the charity. Well, of course, the charity couldn't believe its luck, moving over to the green fields of Clapham into this enormous building, which they adapted and moved into, as I said, in 1904. Next door to the Home for Aged Jews in Nightingale Lane was another Jewish institution, which was the Jews Deaf and Dumb School. Now, the Jews Deaf and Dumb School, which eventually closed in the 1960s, was a residential home for Jewish children. And it wasn't a coincidence that it was next door to the Home for Aged Jews, because that property was, or the land, was bought by the brother of the Viscount de Sturm. It was actually a very interesting building. It closed in the late 1960s, and a friend and supporter of Nightingale purchased the land for £167,000 and donated it to Nightingale. Another interesting story about the school was that during the war, it was commandeered by what is now MI5, who wanted the building to train people. Now, the people that it was training were young French women who had got to this country and wanted to help the war effort. Obviously, they had to be interrogated to ensure that they were bona fide, that they weren't spies, and they were then trained to drop into occupied France behind enemy lines. So this place was run by the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. A number of women who were trained in this building did drop into behind enemy lines. They were all caught, and sadly they were all murdered. Anyway, the reason I'm mentioning all this is because some years ago, probably about 10 years ago, I met a local historian who was doing some research on the building and on the SOE. And he suggested, and I readily agreed, that we put some kind of commemorative plaque on the site of where the building was. And to cut a long story short, we contacted MI5, the successor organization, and Princess Anne, Princess Royal, who was the patron, came along, I think it was in 2012, and unveiled a plaque. So that was quite interesting. So on this property that was purchased, on which the school sat, we built a new building which accommodated 160 people. It cost £1.5 million to build, but the building company belonged to Sir Charles Claw, the late Sir Charles Claw, so we got a staff discount at £1.5 million. The building went up between 1973 and 1976, which must have been the worst time ever to build the building. It was at the time of the 3-day week. There was a massive shortage of materials. They couldn't get steel. And basically anything that could go wrong with the building project went wrong. And eventually it opened in 1976. And through connections, which I'll explain, we were able to get Prince Charles to come along and open it. The connection was that normally if you knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, it was possible to get a member of the royal family as long as you could arrange a donation to their favourite charity. So Prince Charles came along in 1976. It was the first job that he had when he came out of the Navy, actually. So he was still a very young man. And again, as a young boy from the provinces, it was hugely exciting for me to meet a member of the royal family, although I did have the good fortune to meet numerous other members of the royal family as the years went by. So this building provided another 160 rooms. It had the very original name at the time of the new extension. It's now known as the GLC, the Gerald Lipton Centre. And this brought the total number of people being cared for at Nightingale to 370, huge number of people. You have to bear in mind that at that time, the vast majority of people that were coming into the home, not only Nightingale, but other homes as well, were people that were coming in mainly for social reasons rather than from extreme care reasons. They were also able to come because the funding was so readily available. So people would come because they were lonely, because they wanted a little bit of stimulation. And there was massive, massive demand. And just to give you an idea of the difference, the people then were still very, very much younger. They were fitter and more active. And each of the 4 floors that accommodated 40 residents had one staff member who was called a house mother, who was a resident on the floor. The residents were expected to keep their own rooms clean and tidy and to make their own beds. So it was a completely different world to today. And another interesting feature about the building, this was considered fairly revolutionary at the time, was that on the ground floor, we constructed 3 television lounges, one for BBC One, one for BBC Two, and one for ITV. But when Channel 4 and Sky and everything else came, that all went out of the window. I mentioned that on one side of Nightingale was the Jews Deaf and Dumb School. On the other side was another Jewish institution, which was known as, initially it was known as the Jewish Home of Rest, and subsequently Birchland's Jewish Hospital. It was started by the same group of people that were running Nightingale. It was nationalized when the National Health Service came into being in 1948, so it was no longer anything to do with Nightingale, although in the early 90s we had the dubious honor of purchasing it back from the government, albeit it came with a substantial amenities fund at the time. And that so eventually we rebuilt much of Birchland's at the time. We adapted it and rebuilt it. And that building was opened in 1981 by the Duke of Edinburgh. And the connection with the Duke of Edinburgh was that the president of the charity at the time was a man called Sir Charles Abrahams, who owned and was the chairman of Aquascutum, the tailors. And he was very friendly with the Duke of Edinburgh, and so he managed to persuade him to come. Another big thrill for me in 1983 was meeting Diana, the Princess of Wales. So I can remember this visit very, very clearly. And again, how did we manage to get Diana, Princess of Wales? I think this might be classified information, but I think I can declassify it now because quite a long number of years have passed. There was a man who some of you may remember, called Monty Modlin, a sort of a comedian. And Monty Modlin was very, very well connected. And he was friendly with the Princess of Wales. And he let it be known that if we could arrange for somebody, a donor, not the charity, a donor, to give him a sum of money, he could secure the Princess of Wales. And he was as good as his word, and he did. And she came on an informal visit. I remember it very clearly because it wasn't announced, it wasn't, for some reason, it wasn't in the Royal Circular. Yet on the day of the visit, there were crowds and crowds outside, so somehow people had got to know. And she came in and she was delightful. She was nearly as shy as I was, but a real pleasure to meet. Gradually over the years, the home modernized, and the number of people living there gradually reduced because we gradually did away with these dormitories and multi-bedded accommodation. As it was in 1976, when we opened the new extension, everybody had their own room, they had their own loo, they had their own shower. A lot of people, even people that were on the committee at the time, thought they were completely mad. What do they need their own rooms for? What do they need their own loo for, etc.? And there was still a little bit of an attitude around at that time as, well, we're a charity, we're doing them a favor, let them eat cake. And that was the way some people thought. But thank goodness not everybody thought that way, and that's how things have progressed over the years. In 1991, we were given a very generous donation from a family called the Balint family, who were Hungarian Jews, and we built a new wing, demolishing 2 older wings that stood on the premises, one of which was known as married quarters. And again, something a bit military or a bit, a bit of the poorhouse about it. Another royal visit, I hope you'll excuse me jumping about a little bit here. So another royal visit which took place from a then royal in the early 90s was from Fergie. And that's not the Manchester United football manager, but Sarah Ferguson. Now, this was also an interesting story. So how did we get Sarah Ferguson, who was still a royal at that time, to come and visit Nightingale and to speak at our dinner the same evening? She was very friendly with David Frost. David Frost was very friendly with the Duchess of Norfolk. And they were patrons of a charity called the Help the Hospice Movement. And again, for a consideration of charitable donation this time to the Help the Hospice Movement, we got a package deal. We got David Frost and Fergie and the Duchess of Norfolk, who visited Nightingale one morning, and then that evening, Sarah Ferguson and David Frost spoke at our dinner in the evening. And that was one of the first dinners that we held at the Guild Hall. One of the great experiences which I did have during my career was meeting so many really, really interesting people, some of them famous, some of them not famous. So when I joined in 1973, during the 1970s, the board consisted, amongst others, of a man called Maurice Lee, who ran a large property company called Allied London Properties, a man called David Claw, who was the brother of the late Sir Charles Claw, a man called Jack Sampson, who was the chair of a company called, it doesn't exist anymore, called UDS, United Drapery Stores, who ran, amongst other department stores, Alders, the group Alders, who in fact had a store in Croydon. Charles Abrahams, who I mentioned, of Aquascutum, Cecil Elsom, an architect from a firm called Elsom, Pack and Roberts, who did a lot of work for the Crown Estate and for the government. And another interesting man was Sir Max Raine, who was the president of the charity at one point, and a man called Jarvis Astaire, who I'll mention again later on. David Claw was a fundraiser par excellence. He had enormous success. Now, some of that success was the fact that his brother was Sir Charles Claw. I'm assuming everybody knows who Sir Charles Claw was. If one mentions to younger people today, he was as rich as Charlie Claw, they've no idea who you were talking about, of course. So David Claw had what one might call leverage. So he would go and visit somebody, and he would ask them for money, and he would make it known, not in a terribly subtle way, but if they wanted to carry on doing business with Charles Claw or with Selfridges, it might be in their interest to make a donation of £5,000. That's the way fundraising worked in those days. He was very, very pushy, but incredibly successful and raised huge amounts of money. And indeed, the Claw family, his brother, Sir Charles Claw, was incredibly generous. And after his death, his daughter, Dame Vivian Duffield, continued giving from the Claw Foundation as well. These group of trustees that I mentioned were very much, if you'll excuse the expression, from mainstream Jewry. They were all members of either Western Marble Arch Orthodox Synagogue or St. John's Wood or Central Synagogue. That was the sort of world that they moved in. But there had previously been a different group of people that were very much involved in the running of the home. And they were what one may call a more anglicized group of people who were from St. John's Wood Liberal Synagogue and from West London Synagogue. They weren't Orthodox, but they aggressively fought to defend and protect the Orthodox standards of Nightingale House, which was always run as an Orthodox home. So I worked alongside Asher Corran for much of my career. He had taken over in 1967 as the chief executive from a man called Michael Slather. I worked with Asher from 1973 to 1997 when he retired, and at that point I was to take over as CEO. Times had changed and times were continuing to change. In the late 1990s, new legislation came into being called the Community Care Legislation, the Community Care Act. And this was the beginning of a recognition that the country could not afford to carry on funding a limitless number of older people wanting to come into care homes. I'd mentioned previously that anybody that wanted to come into a home pretty much could do. But that then began to change. More and more older people needing support without a corresponding increase in people in employment to pay taxes. Yeah, so that was really the beginning of the changes. Sadly, even up until today, the whole question of funding of long-term care of the elderly has not been resolved. You will have heard the government of Boris talking recently about how he had solved the problem of social care once and for all, X number of £1 million going to the NHS and social care. This is an apolitical point, but it's all smoke and mirrors. It's not the case. All he is doing is the same thing that successive governments of differing colours have done. Is the problem of funding now of the long-term care is so complex and so difficult. It's a political hot potato. It's too hot to handle. So what Boris is doing now is just pushing it a little bit further down the road. And by the time somebody else has to deal with it, he will not be around. It is a real problem. It's not an easy problem to solve, but the longer one leaves this problem, the more and more difficult it's going to be. I'd like to say something about fundraising. First of all, Nightingale, in common with all other charities, received no funding at all from the government for capital building projects. So every new building that Nightingale wanted to put up or improvements it wanted to make, all of that money had to be raised from the community. Fundraising for capital building projects is much, much easier than raising money to pay the bills, to pay the gas bill, to pay the staff. Having said that, the community over the decades I was involved were unbelievably generous, and many, many, many millions of pounds for buildings have been raised. So we were involved in all sorts of fundraising activities, and I'll just mention a few unusual things that happened. One day I think this must have been in the early 2000s, I received a telephone call from a man called Harry Davison. He said, I've got something to tell you, which is good news for you, for your charity. Would you come up and see me? So sounded very enticing. So I went up to see him. He lived in a beautiful flat in Carlton Terrace, in Regent's Park. And he told me a story which was difficult to believe or difficult to take in. So this man, Harry Davison, had a brother, and his brother, who had died a couple of years previously, had lived much of his adult life in America, in Charleston, in the Deep South. and he had left his estate to Harry. And Harry told me that he wanted to donate a building in Charleston to the charity, but not just any building. This was a large commercial building consisting of shops on the ground floor and offices on the upper floors. And it was very difficult to understand why would this be? Why would he want to give it to charity? Why would he want to give it to us? And to cut a long, fairly boring story short, it was true, and he did give us this building, which was incredibly valuable. And the donation was made that we couldn't sell the building in Charleston until 5 years after Harry Davison had died. And eventually he did die, and eventually we did sell the building. What was interesting was, why did he choose Nightingale out of all of the charities, all of the Jewish charities that there were? And the reason was this. This man, Harry Davison, had no real connection with any charities, but particularly not Nightingale. But he told a story about every year, around about October, when he went for a walk in Regent's Park, he would bump into David Claw. And David Claw, bear in mind, who had been fundraising for Nightingale, would say to him, "Give us a couple of £100 for the old people's home. I'm selling raffle tickets." And this happened over a number of years. And that stuck in this man's mind. So when he realized he was going to give the property to charity, he gave it to Nightingale. Another interesting story, I went one day to Canada to a conference in Toronto, and it was a conference of basically people in North America running Jewish old people's homes. And I met a man there from a very, very large care home and hospital in Toronto called Baycrest. And we were talking over dinner one evening about fundraising. And he said to me, "Have you ever tried the Weinberg Foundation?" Never heard of the Weinberg Foundation. Turned out that they were a very, very large foundation in America, one of the largest, based in Baltimore, and they were Jewish. So when I came back, I put together basically a cold application to the Weinberg Foundation for funding. And unbelievably, they asked a couple of questions and they agreed. And they donated to us a multi-million-dollar endowment fund. Couldn't believe it. I was very popular at Nightingale at that time. And subsequently, we had an opportunity to ask them for a bit more money, because we had another visit from the Duke of Edinburgh in 2001. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could invite this Weinberg family over and they could meet the Queen's husband? So we invited them, they came, the Duke of Edinburgh did the necessary amount of schmoozing with them, and they gave us another couple of $1 million, which was quite incredible. And one last fundraising story. I mentioned that there was a man on the scene called Jarvis Astaire. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He was initially a boxing promoter. He was the first person to have the idea of doing live television broadcasts of big boxing matches from Las Vegas in cinemas in the West End. So he would hire the Odeon in Leicester Square and show live a big match. And later on, he was a deputy chairman of Wembley. A very, very interesting man. And anyway, one day, came into work on a Friday morning, and the telephones were ringing off the hook. We didn't understand what was going on. And people were ringing up asking for tickets. Tickets for what? I had no idea at the time. It turned out that Jarvis Astaire had booked Jackie Mason, who at that time had never been to the UK, to come to London to do various charitable gigs, including one in aid of Nightingale at the Dominion Theatre. Well, we could have sold it 10 times over. It was quite incredible. And we made a lot of money from that as well. Yeah, so just, and another thing which this man used to do, Jarvis Astaire, and again, this was in the early 70s, was he used to run something called the Anglo-American Boxing Club. and they would have live boxing dinners, usually in the Hilton in Park Lane, all men, everybody wearing dinner suit. And again, people would pay to have a table, and then there would be a raffle and an appeal and everything else. Also raised a lot of money. I'm sorry, I did think of one other fundraising thing. I'm not going to go on too much longer, but I did think of one other fundraising project I got involved with, which was quite amusing. Somebody involved with the home was in America and came across a fundraising technique which was really unheard of here. And this was called a duck race. What is a duck race? A duck race is a very elaborate form of raffle. So what happens is you sell ducks, not literally, but you sell people basically a raffle number, which equates to a little plastic duck, the kind that the children, the grandchildren would have in the bath. And so we sold thousands and thousands of these ducks for £5 each, whatever it was. And then on the allotted day, one summer, we had arranged for these thousands and thousands of ducks to be poured into the River Thames. And the idea is that they float down the Thames, and one of the ducks is a winner, and the winner wins a very valuable, I think it was a car or something. And this had been done very frequently in America, but had not been done in the UK. Well, it wasn't a good idea for us to be the guinea pigs, because what happened was they used kind of inflatable bumpers in which to channel the ducks to go down. But as soon as the ducks had been released from a sort of tipper thing, they all jumped out. They came over the tops of the barriers. The ducks went everywhere. It was chaos, absolute chaos. And it was very, very embarrassing. We had a lot of press coverage, unfortunately, which I thought beforehand was going to be good. And we would not have been very popular at COP26, because what happened was a lot of the ducks got caught up in reeds and stuff at the side of the River Thames, and they weren't biodegradable, and they stayed there for a long time. So that wasn't our most successful thing. During my career, I was invited and attended a number of really interesting events. We did a reception with Sherry Booth at 10 Downing Street. We had fundraising events at Spencer House, the Rothschild home in St James's, Lancaster House, Blenheim Palace. We had a dinner, numerous dinners over the year at Guildhall, Goldsmiths, literary lunches at Claridge's. We used to do a bazaar at the Grosvenor, subsequently at the Cumberland Hotel, opera at Holland Park, and much, much more. I also had the pleasure of meeting many famous and interesting people. And I'll just tell you a few of them who are in no order of significance at all. John Burko came to Nightingale to talk to the residents. Esther Ranson, Celia Imbrie, the actress, Barbara Windsor, Maureen Lipman, David Baddiel, David Jacobs. Anybody remember David Jacobs? He used to be on Jukebox Jury many, many years ago. Ian Hislop, who runs Private Eye. Vanessa Feltz, Ringo Starr came once. Michael Howard, the politician, Simon Sharma, Howard Jacobson, Frank Bruno, the boxer, Yehudi Menuhin, numerous mayors, members of parliament, ministers, and 2 chief rabbis. So I met a lot of people. One of the best things to happen was Edwina Curry becoming involved with Nightingale. Edwina, at one stage, was living in Nightingale Lane, and she was going through a period where she wanted to reconnect with the Jewish community, and she wanted to do some voluntary work. So she came along to Nightingale. She wanted to become a volunteer, and she said, how would you like to have a book club? So we said that would be wonderful. And she started a book club, which was very different to most other book clubs. She would give a small group of our residents a book to read, and then the following month, she would contact the author and get the authors to come. And because of who she was, she had this pull, and the authors would come. And so we had Tracy Chevalier, Joanna Harris, Beryl Bainbridge, Penny Vincenzi, Julian Fellows, and many, many more. And if you can imagine what a thrill that was for ladies in their 80s and 90s to sit around a table discussing with the author, why did you write that on page 85? It really was wonderful. Looking back now of spending my entire working career, 42 years at Nightingale, I've got mixed feelings. I kind of felt that I was always destined to work for a Jewish organization. I love working in the community, and I was always proud of what I did, and I was also very proud, obviously, of Nightingale. And I was proud of the community and what it does to support the welfare charities. I saw the very best of humanity, and sometimes I saw the very worst as well. Why have I got mixed feelings when I look back? Well, should I have stayed there all my working career? Would I have been better off moving on? I'll never know. I don't know. But I have very happy memories. I feel that I've done something worthwhile. And if nothing else, if I were ever to appear on the television program Mastermind, my specialist subject would be Nightingale House. That's it. Hope I didn't go on a bit too much there.
You're right. You're unmuted now. No, that was lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. No, I enjoyed that very, very much.
Fantastic. So interesting.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions?
Yes. Well, while I'm speaking, perhaps I could just ask a question which occurred to me, because Nightingale, obviously, we're in South London, with Clapham, South London, and yet the majority of London Jewry is centred on North London. So how is the relationship, in fact, between, say, North London and South London in this aspect of looking after older people?
Sure. Well, I explained earlier on that the only reason that Nightingale happens to be located in South London is for that purely historical reason.
Yeah.
The fact that the property was donated. Now, of course, you know, for many, many years, there was a large community in South London, in Brixton, and South East London, and Streatham. And the other big difference that happened over the years is that what really matters is not so much where the residents come from, but where their children come from. And increasingly, the children and the grandchildren live in North London. Now, in the 70s and maybe in the 80s, perhaps it wasn't such a big deal crossing London, but it is a big deal now, and it's a real issue. And I think that one of the reasons, I think that is one of the reasons why the charity decided to tie up with Hammerson House, because in the long run, clearly there is going to be lesser demand for the accommodation at Nightingale. And the other reason, in direct answer to your question, is that much of our fundraising was being done in central London and in northwest London. And some people would turn around and say, well, what's Nightingale got to do with us? It's in Clapham. I'm never going to go to Clapham. So it has been a problem, and I think it will continue to be a problem.
How many people are in Nightingale?
Today, and bear in mind, I mentioned at the beginning, at one stage there was 370. Today, there are 125.
Oh, gosh.
So do you ever see it becoming for non-Jews as well as Jews in order to fill it up?
I think, Michael, that will be, my personal view is that that will be the last resort. I think before that, the charity is more likely to hive off part of the site, either sell it or perhaps lease it to somebody like Bupa or to a private care home. The reason that I think taking in non-Jewish people would be a last resort is fundraising. Again, all of the charity's fundraising is done in the Jewish community, and people give thinking that they are giving to help older members of the Jewish community. And I think that would be more difficult if there were non-Jewish people living there. Having said that, that's exactly what has happened in the Jewish homes in the provinces, where they have started to, in Birmingham, for example, there's a Jewish home called the Andrew Cohen Home, which is less than 50% Jewish now.
Can you say just a little bit how the funding works for somebody who wants to go into the Nightingale? In terms of what money they have of their own and what money they can claim.
So this doesn't relate solely to Nightingale, but to any care home. If you want to come into a care home, if you've got more than £23,000, £23,250, you can come in as long as you pay for yourself. And at the present time, the cost of coming into Nightingale, depending upon the level of care that you need, would be between £1,100 a week and probably about £1,400 a week. That's what it costs. Those are the rates. If you've genuinely got less than £23,000, you have to make an application to the local authority. Not the local authority where Nightingale is, but the local authority where you're living. And then you've got to jump through 2 sets of hoops, which are very, very difficult, increasingly difficult. The first set of hoops is, do you meet the physical criteria? Do you really need to go into a care home? Or could you manage at home with an hour's help in the morning and an hour's help in the evening? And those criteria are getting tougher and tougher. Once you've jumped through those hoops and you do meet your local authority's criteria, then they will fund, but they will fund at the level that they're prepared to give. So I mentioned just now that the kind of minimum cost privately to go into Nightingale is £1,100. A local authority might be prepared to give £650 a week. And of course, that's where much of the charitable fundraising comes in, is to help bridge that gap. But if they're a family, if they're a direct family, by which I mean siblings or children, then the charity will ask them to make a contribution. It won't be contingent upon it, but they will ask them to make a voluntary contribution. And the charity would, or they did in my day, and I'm out of it for 6 years now, would ask people in good faith to say, ask them how much they would be prepared to give. And as long as it was reasonable, one would accept that. Sometimes people that are living in Winnington Road might turn around and say, I'm terribly sorry, but my son-in-law's unemployed and my sister-in-law is disabled, and I'm terribly sorry, we can't afford to make a contribution. That's difficult to take, because then you're thinking, why on earth should we be asking people in the community to make donations to help support your parents? But I should say, and I think everybody knows this now, is that local authorities are spending an ever-increasing proportion of their overall expenditure on adult social care. So it's becoming more and more of a problem.
What about people that can't manage on their own if they are ill or something?
Well, again, the same criteria will apply. It's slightly easier to get funding for help at home than it is to get into a care home. And the reason for that is that when a local authority is assessing how much capital you have got, if you want to go into a care home, they take into account the value of your property. But if you feel that you need what's called domiciliary care in your own house, they discount the value of the property. So it's easier to get help. But you know, I'm also involved with a domiciliary care company, a company called Sweet Tree. I'm on their board now. I would say 3/4 of the people, of the clients, are paying privately, and 1/4 are being paid by local authorities. But with domiciliary care in your own home, there's a new problem now. And that is that it's becoming very, very difficult to find staff. Since Brexit and since coronavirus, and sometimes we have to turn away business because we simply cannot get the staff, which is a real problem, not just for our company, but for everybody.
Have you got medical staff in the home?
At Nightingale?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Yeah, we've got medical staff, yes. What's most difficult is to find carers. Carers and trained nurses. Very, very difficult, yeah.
What proportion of the residents are in the dementia area?
I think it's easier to say. I think it's easier to say which proportion are not. The majority. It's funny because I was going to say that earlier on. When I started at Nightingale, there was one tiny little area for people who had something they used to call senile dementia. Now we've got a tiny little area for people that haven't got dementia. And of course, the main reason that the majority of people go into care homes is because of the onset of dementia. Even if it hasn't been formally diagnosed, that's why people go into care homes in the main. And of course, another reason that there is so much dementia about today is that people live to a much greater age.
Exactly.
If you go to a country, this is not scientific what I'm about to say, but it'll give you a flavor of what I'm trying to say. If you go to a country like Zimbabwe, where life expectancy is probably late 50s, there's very little dementia there because people simply don't live long enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Leon, the Jewish aspect of Nightingale, I gather that at the beginning it was presumably what we would call United Synagogue rules and regulations type of thing. And what about now? Is it because I'm just thinking about what you were saying about maybe as a last resort inviting non-Jewish people, which I would have thought would make it very difficult administratively.
Yep.
If you're following certain rules, Jewish rules, for example.
Well, they would have to abide by the house rules. So what's happened, for example, I know in Birmingham and Leeds and in Manchester, is that if non-Jewish people came in, so Nightingale still has strict kashrut. So anybody coming in would have to accept that. They would not be able to bring any of their own food into the building. And yeah, they would just have to expect the fact that it's an Orthodox Jewish home. Now, some people,
wouldn't get. I was going to say they wouldn't get milk in their coffee after a meal.
Absolutely, absolutely. Although in the privacy of their own room, they could
do it.
Yeah. But they still couldn't bring in ham sandwiches.
No. Okay, thank you.
Could I just ask, the reduction in numbers I've found quite staggering, but of course, Hammerson Home originated in Whittington Road because I was on the first committee raising funds in my teens because I happened to go out with the daughter of the person who funded it, Patricia Hammerson. Yeah. And
I know her well, Patricia Beecham. Yep.
Yeah, Patricia Beecham. Yes, you mentioned my name. She'll know me well. That's an absolute aside. But what I was going to say is, is it therefore more difficult to raise money? You gave the story about if you go to somebody at Whittington Road and they say they haven't got it, but because they will give the Hammerson Home in Whittington Road. And is it because there are far fewer Jews now in South London, like in Streatham and Brixton, and that is why you're really suffering on the numbers? Yeah. Well,
it's a combination of that. I've been in South London for 40 years, and the pattern that I have seen has been a lot of, first of all, there are less Jewish people in South London, but a lot of people of my age, or maybe a bit older, once their children move to North London, and then they have their own children, grandchildren, people are leaving to go over to be nearer the children. Yeah. So, I mean, I think you've mentioned an important point, because I think, and again, I can't speak with authority on this, but my personal view is that going forward, Hammerson, I think, will be a huge success by definition of where it's located. And I think Nightingale will become less significant over the years. Yeah. So incidentally, I mentioned 125. That, of course, is the number of people currently at Nightingale House. The new Hammerson, which was just opened in May of this year, will accommodate 110 people.
Right. Okay.
And if you haven't seen it, it's the most wonderful building. It's fabulous, fabulous.
And just a complete aside, you referred to Jack Sampson and UDS days.
Yeah.
I effectively almost took over from him because I became the finance director at Alders.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So there was a guy called Maurice Estrin who lived in Kingston. He was, and I got involved there. I knew Jack Sampson quite well.
Well, he was a very, very nice man.
Charm personified. I don't know whether I was.
So when you know, I kept talking about this, the new extension that we opened in 1976. A lot of what was incredible, and again, it was in a different age, was that apart from fundraising for money, we were fundraising for things. So everything that went in that 160 bedded home was donated. The furniture came from the Jewish furniture manufacturers. All of the soft furnishings came from Alders and Marks and Spencers. It was incredible. But of course, there aren't that many Jewish people left in retail now.
Right.
Any other questions?
You didn't mention the wall wing. Was that Morris Wall?
Yes.
Who donated that?
Yeah. So I mentioned a wing called the Balint wing. Unfortunately, the Balint wing opened round about the same time as the community care legislation came in. So that was the very, very beginning of the numbers beginning to dip a little bit. And also the accommodation in that building wasn't great. So eventually, after about 15 years, we rebuilt that wing into a beautiful building called the Wall Wing. And the Wall family, you'll find the Wall name all over Jewish London. There's a Wall campus. In fact, Hammerson House, they have cleverly changed the address to Hammerson House, the Wall campus. Jewish Care have also got a Wall campus. They have given away mega millions.
Wow.
So if you want to go into Nightingale, Leon, can you specify that you want to go into the Wall wing?
No.
I'm told I'm told the class of rooms and so on in the Wall wing is superior.
It is, but what happens is in Nightingale's made up of, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 different units, and each of these units is for a different level of care. So even though the accommodation in the Wall wing is excellent, you probably wouldn't want to go onto one of the floors if you knew everybody there had severe dementia, because that's what it's for.
Right. Oh, that's what it's for.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So I will be accepted.
Okay. I think we've reached 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I found it a fascinating and interesting lecture, and I want to thank you on behalf of everybody.
Indeed.
And if there are no more questions, then I will end the meeting. So last chance if anybody wants to say something.
How do we go about reserving our room there, Leon?
Yes.
Well,
Yes, I'm going to.
It's a question of who you know, really.
We know you, so we want the whole building.
No, you're all too young to need Nightingale.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for asking me to talk. Anyway, I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. So we'll end the meeting. Thank you.
Very interesting.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.